I want to read what you said in your book about Vladimir Putin, because you first met him during your first year there in 2009. And you write that power oozes from him. You say, in all my meetings with Putin, he gave no sign that he recognized a shared future on the European continent. For him, the sense of grievance went deep. Mother Russia had been invaded, sacrificed its millions, and suffered over centuries. He was not there to offer friendship. That doesn't bode well for where we are today.
No, but it was important even then to kind of understand where he came from. You know, Russia had gone through turbulence for decades. It had in him, so it thought, a leader who brought stability of a kind, who was very proud of his country, who was very determined. His country was, in his terms, a major power. It was not a regional power. I think it's an accumulation of ideas. And I think he saw that the West, in broad terms, did not take Russia as seriously as it should.
You feature, along with many other players, in a very, very, exhaustive series on Putin versus the West, which is on BBC right now. You and others say very similar things, that essentially Putin is a liar, that that's part of his diplomatic toolkit, and that when you guys go to negotiate with him, I mean, you know that he's lying to you. Knowing that, how does one even negotiate with him now?
Well, it goes back to the idea that you've got to verify everything that he says or does. And you have to start from the principle that he is not telling you the truth. He's telling you either what he thinks you want to hear or simply what suits him to say. The evidence has to be what's going on the ground. So when he says we haven't got anybody in Ukraine and you can see them, it's pretty obvious that
and this
he's
is what
not
he
telling
said to
the
you.
truth. Yeah, that he sees things in the way that he chooses to. So with me, it was about, well, if we do allow Ukraine to have this kind of trade agreement with the EU, what's to stop all this stuff coming across our border, he would say, that's contaminated or it's not good enough or we don't want it? Well, the answer is your border controls, but that's not the point in his view. In his view, it's about letting in some force that he doesn't want to have in his country.
And you write in the book that the first major signs of potential crisis over Ukraine, and this whole thing that is now, everybody can see what it is, was obvious to you in November 2013, I think, about Ukraine's initial ask to have a stronger, I think, what's it called, a partnership agreement with the EU?
Yeah, it was a special agreement that was sort of trade plus, called an association agreement. And the president of Ukraine then, Yanukovych, was due to come and sign it. It had been negotiated for 7 years. They'd initialed it, which meant all the work had been done, and all it required was for him to come and put his name to it. And he came to the meeting and then said he wouldn't sign. And it was obvious pretty quickly. I went to see him in Kiev, and he made clear that the reason was Russia, both in terms of what Russia could do to their economy, but also in terms of his fear that Russia would see this. Yeah, and that Russia would see this as a move towards the West. It's been going on for years.
To me, that shows that Putin has never wanted Ukraine to have anything other than an eastward view, didn't want Ukraine to have any westward links that were too strong. So when he says things and half the world believes that it's about NATO expansion and this and that, it's been going on way before that.
Yeah, well, the original reason that he moved into Ukraine was to do with the European Union. It wasn't NATO. I mean, NATO's been kind of added in because, as he says, all the countries that joined the EU that have been in the former Soviet Union also joined NATO. So he sees the two, or he claims to see the two, as indivisible. But the reality was this was about trade and economic issues. And it was about Ukraine's decision to try and develop its economy in a particular model or style, which was European. And that he could not tolerate.
When you met him face to face, what did he say to you about yourself or the West? For instance, you did go to Kiev right after this issue in Lithuania. About a month or two later, you were in Kiev. And it was at the beginning of the Maidan, and the people of Ukraine were very disappointed, and they were protesting against Yanukovych because they held signs, EU and Ukraine or the like. You were there. What did Putin say to you about being there and being so involved?
We saw him in January for what was a regular 6-monthly summit between the European Union and Russia. And he said to me that I shouldn't be in the square. My answer was, I would do what I felt was necessary. But as I pointed out to him and to Yanukovych, the people standing in the square, who were all sorts of people, families, young people, journalists, activists, sure, but there were lots and lots of people who just felt that the promise that Yanukovych had made in his election to take them into this agreement had been broken. But I said, when I go into that square, these people are all holding EU flags. As the EU's foreign minister, it's my responsibility, in a sense, to kind of know what's going on. I didn't stand on platforms in the square. I didn't make speeches in the square. But I did go and talk to people to find out who they were and why they were there.
And Putin didn't like that at all?
No, he didn't. But of course, the Russians particularly didn't like when they started to see politicians arriving. And I remember Sergei Lavrov saying to me at one point, if I went and did that in a European Union country, what would you think?
In retrospect, do you believe that Putin has been encouraged by the EU and the West's rather timid reaction to his invasion and annexation of Crimea? You talk about the official EU position on Russia's invasion. I knew invasion wouldn't stand. It would be too strong for some countries, but it would be a good place to start and keep on board those who feared that we had not understood what was going on. We spent 6 hours discussing the crisis with lots of amendments to the text from ministers. The word invasion became act of aggression in the final text.
The problem, I think, in a way, was we didn't quite know what we were looking at. When you're in the middle of something going on, you don't know what it is. You don't know where it's going to end. I remember very clearly sitting in the office on the Sunday night before the meeting at which we had to decide the words. And we didn't know whether Russia would stop, whether they would keep going. And so I think holding all of the countries together around a position that actually accepted that this was aggression was good in its way. Now, looking back, it turned quite quickly into a sort of semi-frozen conflict. And in fact, the last place I was before we all went into lockdown was actually in Kiev again, looking at what was going on. And I was quite worried then that we'd sort of not really given them the support that they felt they needed. They didn't feel that people were looking at them because we'd moved on. Back to and then what? Things happen, you kind of deal with them as best you can, and then the next crisis happens, and the next, and people move on.
It's interesting because, I guess it's obvious for a diplomat, but even for someone as adversarial as Putin turned out to be during your time there and since, you actually needed them and worked with them constructively on other issues. For instance, on Iran. Russia was instrumental to getting the nuclear deal.
Absolutely right. I was flying from Vienna, where I'd be spending a week with the Russian team, including the Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, directly to Kiev, where I was standing on a platform condemning Russia for what it'd done, and then flying back. And literally, we compartmentalised on both sides what was happening. It was quite extraordinary. And indeed, when I met Putin in Minsk, he made the point to me that this was not about Iran, where we were all working together and where they were confident in what was going on and I think in what I was doing. And so it was bizarre.
Well, then I'm interested to hear what you think should happen about trying to start up negotiations with Iran today as it's hammering protesters and as it's executing people publicly and the human rights of Iran finally are under the microscope. And there's no deal and there's no negotiations. And the Americans basically are saying, and even the EU, by the way, the EU president said to me, there's no negotiations on the nuclear deal right now.
Yeah. It's shocking. What Iran is doing to its people is truly, truly shocking. In a situation where I thought it was impossible to be shocked, I am, by what's going on there. But it's back to this point about diplomacy is, for me, the drip, drip, drip stuff. It goes on and on and on. I negotiated with Iran for 4.5 years, and I neither started nor ended the talks. And that's how it has to be. So that you need to keep the conversation in some way, at some level, somewhere, moving in order that when you get to the moment when it might be possible again,